Hello, everyone. My name is Greg Caruso. I am director of the Patrick J. Wade Center for Applied Ethics here at Fairfield University. And this is part of our seminar series called the Wade Center for Applied Ethics Seminar. I just want to take a moment to tell you very quickly a little bit about the Wade Center, and then I will introduce our speaker today, and they will present for roughly about 45 minutes, and then there will be a question and answer period of roughly 45 minutes as long as it lasts. And the way that things are set up, the guests cannot visually be seen, but when we get to the question and answer period, you could use the raise hand function and I can unmute you and you can then ask your question to the speaker. Or if you feel more comfortable, there's the question uh, text box at the bottom of the page, and you could type in your questions and I can read those to our speaker as well. Um, just a little bit about the Wade Center. So the Wade Center for Applied Ethics advances learning, research, and dialogue about the leading ethical issues of our time. We have three core components that comprise our mission, and that's curriculum, research, and outreach. The center offers a number of applied ethics courses across the curriculum, including courses in business ethics, environmental ethics, AI ethics, ethics in engineering, and a whole host of other applied ethics courses. We also support research for students, faculty, and practitioners. And we organize and facilitate a variety of programs, and this seminar series is part of our outreach efforts. So these seminars are open to the public, they're free, and students, faculty, and community members are encouraged to attend. Um, and the goal of the series is really to build community and advance research around applied ethical issues. We tend to encourage jargon-free and supportive discussions that will be accessible to individuals with interest in applied ethics, but who may come from a variety of different backgrounds. And one of the unique features of the series is that we dedicate half of the time to our question and answer period. I'm very excited today to introduce our speaker, Miguel, Alzola. He is a professor and William G. Eaglehofer Distinguished Research Scholar in Business Law and Ethics at Fordham University at the Gabelli School of Business. He specializes in ethical theory, particularly virtue ethics, which is part of what he'll be discussing today, as well as applied ethics. And his current research focuses on virtue ethics and moral psychology. And his talk for today is entitled The Virtuous Hypocrite, Aristotle's Doctrine of the Mean in Adversarial Contexts. So I will mute myself and pass things over to Miguel. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, for the invitation, for having me here. And thank you all for being here today. I'm honored for the opportunity to share my work. But today I want to talk about the puzzle that sits at the intersections of ancient philosophy and contemporary professional life. The title of the paper, as you can see, intends to be provocative, The Virtuous Hypocrite, which sounds like a contradiction. And my goal today is to explain why that apparent contradiction arises, what it tells us about ethical theory, and how we should think about deception in professional roles. So the puzzle that we will consider today is simple to state, but not easy to solve. In certain professional contexts, such as criminal law, politics, professional sports, and markets, we seem to admire behavior that we condemn outside of those professional roles. So deception is praised as professional excellence, and while honesty is treated as naive or as a vice. So what's going on here? Does this show that virtue ethics fails in adversarial contexts, or is something else going on? So I'll start with three scenes to make the puzzle more concrete. Three scenes that you probably will recognize. So this is a famous hand of God. It was June 22nd, 1986. Argentina and England were playing quarterfinals in the 1986 World Cup. Maradona punched the ball past the British goalie Peter Shilton and then celebrated as if he had headed it. For those not familiar with soccer, field players cannot use their hands. The referees didn't see it, but it was validated as a goal, and it was the goal. And Peter Shilton, the goalie, he remains furious even today. But in Argentina, where I'm from, the act was not merely accepted and celebrated, but culturally leonized, described through the lens of what we call viveza criolla, with Creole cunning, which is a form of street smart resourcefulness that values the capacity to bend rules without technically breaking them. You wouldn't do that when you're playing soccer, pick up soccer with your friends without a referee. But and you, I mean, you're entitled, and some people would say that you're required to do it when you're playing a professional game for the national team in a World Cup. So the transgression became a mark of national genius. Maradona framed it as symbolic revenge for the Falklands War that happens 4 years earlier in 1982. Maradona called it the hand of God because he said that it was not his hand, but God's that scored that goal. And so this is vice, presumably, elevated to national virtue in an adversarial and, you might say, even geopolitical sporting context. 14 years later, in the 2010 World Cup, England suffered again, this time against Germany in the round of 16. Frank Lampard, the English midfielder, struck a half volley that went over the German goalkeeper Manuel Neuer, hit the underside of the crossbar, and bounced it down 2 to 3 feet over the goal line before spinning back out. The German goalkeeper grabbed the ball and put it back into play with no hesitation, no glance at the line, and as if nothing happened. The goal was disallowed. The photo on the right that you see is, of course, a joke, but the goal could have tied the game. England, demoralized, lost 4-1, and the act was condemned by the British players and the media and the fans, and even by Peter Singer, whose piece that was published in the Guardian, you can see it on the left. Why is cheating okay in football? And of course, he has a negative idea about that. But Neuer, the goalkeeper, and the Germans bragged about it. No one suggested that the goalie should have told the referee that it was a goal. His silence was not dishonesty, but depicted as competitive intelligence. Now, let me move from the soccer field to the courtroom. We are now in 1982. Alton Logan, the man on the screen, on the center of the screen, he was convicted of killing an off-duty corrections officer at a McDonald's in Chicago. Logan was sentenced to life in prison, but he was innocent. Attorneys Dale Coventry and James Kunst knew this from the very beginning because their own client, Andrew Wilson, the guy on the right photo here, whom they were defending for the murder of 2 other police officers, this guy, Wilson, confessed to them that he had also committed the McDonald's killing. And he was gleeful about it. He was pleased, I'm quoting now, he was pleased that the wrong guy had been charged. The lawyers, Coventry and Kuntz, now in the picture, were bound by client confidentiality. They could not disclose Wilson's confession. Instead, they drafted an affidavit proclaiming Logan's innocent. They signed it and locked it in a fireproof strong box that Coventry kept under his bed. So for 26 years, Logan slept on a prison bunk while the document that could have freed him sat beneath the bed of a man who knew he was innocent. Wilson, the real murderer, he died in prison in 2007. Only then did the lawyers came forward. Logan was finally declared innocent in 2009. He received about $200,000 in compensation, which is roughly $7,000 per year of wrongful imprisonment. His 2017 memoir is titled Justice Failed: How Legal Ethics, in quotation marks, kept me in prison for 26 years. The public reaction was outrage. Many demanded Coventry and Kant's, the lawyers, disbursement. But most lawyers defended them. Only 2 states, to my knowledge, Massachusetts and Alaska, have since amended the rules to permit, not to require, disclosure to prevent wrongful incarceration. And the third case is about politics, and it's another well-known case. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 is often seen as the classic case of strong presidential leadership. The standard story is very simple. Kennedy stood firm, and the Soviet, Nikita Khrushchev, they backed down. But that story is itself a product of deception, as we came to know a few years ago. The crisis was actually resolved through a secret deal known only to 9 American officials. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba, and the United States would quietly remove its Jupiter missile from Turkey within 5 months. When Robert Kennedy presented this deal to the Soviet ambassador, he was direct. He said, "We will remove the missiles, but you can never speak of it publicly." The secret was held for over 16 years. So what matters here is not just that the president deceived his own public and his own allies. It is that the deception was so successful that it became the defining myth of the Cold War. The idea that toughness alone, without compromise, has forced a superpower to retreat. And even now that we know the full story through declassified records, the episode is still celebrated as Kennedy's finest hour. The deception is not seen as a failure of honesty, but as a proof of his skill. The vice of dishonesty is treated as a virtue of strategic discretion. A mutual compromise, hidden from the world, is admired precisely because it was hidden. So, what these cases have in common is that in each of these cases, we observe the same pattern. Honesty looks like weakness or something naive, while deception looks like professional excellence. So I'm calling this ethical inversion, and it poses a genuine challenge to ethical theory in general, and more specifically to virtue ethics. So the central question of this paper gravitates around this thing. Aristotle tells us that virtue is a mean between extremes, that the virtuous person finds the right balance between excess and deficiency. So truthfulness, for example, is a mean between boastfulness and false modesty. We normally think of deception as a vice and honesty as a virtue. But if adversarial roles invert this, if they make deception look like excellence and honesty look like a vice, then the question is, does the doctrine of the mean fail in adversarial context? Has Aristotle give us a theory that only works in cooperative, in friendly relationships, but breaks down when people compete? Or is this just the appearance of failure? It's just an illusion. So my thesis is that the doctrine of the mean does not fail. But adversarial context reveals something very important, that the mean cannot do the whole work alone. It depends on other parts of Aristotle's ethics that are often implicit. And so when we make these dependencies more explicit, the apparent paradox often dissolves. So that's what I'm going to argue for. So what I'm planning to do in the next 35 minutes or so is as follows. I'll start with some Aristotelian background, the basic concepts of virtue ethics for those who might not work in this tradition. Next, I will talk about roles and institutions, and I will characterize what makes a context adversarial and why that matters morally. Next, I will discuss the inversion of virtue and vice in adversarial roles, and I will distinguish different forms of deception, because treating deception as a single thing is part of what I think generates the puzzle. Then I'm going to present the heart of the paper, which is an account for distinguishing ethically different kinds of strategic speech in professional roles. And as this is an extension of Aristotle's virtue of truthfulness in the context of adversarial roles, I will call it truthfulness under pressure. And I'll illustrate this framework in the context of business negotiations. I will then consider three objections, if time permits, and sketch how to respond to those objections with the resources provided in this paper. And I will conclude by returning to the title, the Virtuous Hypocrite, and argue that this is not just a character ideal to be embraced, but a diagnostic phenomenon, a sign that adversarial roles can distort moral perception. So virtues can look like hypocrisy, and hypocrisy can look like virtue. And once we understand why, the doctrine of the mean, I submit, survives this test. So um, I'll start with Aristotle and some Aristotelian basics. Again, for those who are not so familiar, for Aristotle, virtue is an excellence of character. So it's not just the performance of good actions. It is a stable disposition, a settled way of feeling, choosing, thinking, and acting that became second nature. Virtues are developed through habits and practice. You became courageous by doing courageous things, honest by practicing honest, generous by giving generously. Over time, these actions shape who you are. And so virtue ethics is fundamentally about formation, education, about what kind of person you are becoming. The point of all this is what is called eudaimonia, usually translated as human flourishing. For Aristotle, the goal of ethics is not to follow a set of rules or principles, but to live the good life, a life that realizes our capacities, fulfills our nature, and involves the excellent exercise of our distinctive human abilities. So when we ask about virtue in professional roles, we're asking not just what should I do in this role, but what kind of person I am becoming through repeated action in this role. So that question matters a lot for understanding adversarial context. Um, Now, one of the main tools to determine virtue is the doctrine of the mean, which is one of Aristotle's most famous ideas. I think it's very intuitive, but also controversial. And I'm going to go into I'm not going into these controversies in the paper, and I will not discuss those here either. But the basic idea is that virtue lies between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. So, courage. Take courage. The coward feels too much fear and too little confidence. In contrast, the reckless person feels too little fear and too much confidence. So the courageous person hits the right balance, feeling appropriate fear and appropriate confidence given the situation. And he does it, the courageous person does it at the right things, from the right motive, in the right way, and the right time, and under the right conditions. Um, so notice that, I mean, virtuous is an intermediate state. Is finding and choosing the intermediate positions in feelings and actions to achieve what is right. But notice that the mean is not an arithmetic midpoint. It's not about splitting the difference or finding moderation in all things. Aristotle is clear that the mean is relative to us. It depends on the agent, the circumstances, and the stakes. Maybe helpful to read the passage here. So I'm in the middle of the screen. Uh, Virtue then is a state that decides consistent in a mean, the mean relative to us, which is defined by reference to reason, which is to say, to the reason by reference to which the prudent person would define it. It is a mean between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. So, what counts this relative to mean things means that it depends on the age and depends on the circumstances, depends on the stakes. What counts as courageous for a trained soldier may be reckless for me or for an untrained civilian. So the mean is determined by what he calls practical wisdom or prudence in the translation that I just read, the capacity to discern what the situation requires. And this is crucial for understanding the context that we will explore. The question is whether practical wisdom might determine that the mean in a competitive negotiation is different from the mean in a conversation with a friend. And if so, whether the difference amounts to a collapse into relativism or something that can be more defensible. So this is how the doctrine of the mean works for the first virtues that he has in the Nicomachean Ethics. In the domain of fear and dominance is courage. In the domain of pleasure and pain is temperance. in the domain of money at small scales is generosity, money at large scales is magnificence, and the domain of great order is magnanimity, and that's the mean that lies between or in between two vices, one of deficiency and one of excess. Um, and so just to get back to courage again, the excessive fearless person is nameless, and those who are excessively confident is rash, and the one who is excessive in fear and deficient in confidence is cowardly, and so on and so forth for the other domains and the other virtues. Now I already mentioned practical wisdom, and this is or phronesis, and this is a very important. They plays an important role. It is the intellectual virtue that Aristotle places at the center of the moral life. Practical wisdom is the capacity to perceive what a situation requires and to deliberate well about how to act and to choose the right action for the right reasons. It is not just knowing general principles, it's knowing how to apply them here and now in this particular case with all this complexity. Aristotle makes a very important distinction that is going to matter here. He distinguishes between practical wisdom from mere cleverness. Cleverness is the ability to figure out how to achieve whatever ends you happen to have. So it is sort of an instrumental intelligence, being good at getting what you want. Practical wisdom, in contrast, is different. It involves not just figuring out how to achieve your ends, but discerning which ends are genuinely good and which means are genuinely appropriate. So a skilled manipulator might be clever. A practically wise person, however, is oriented toward what is genuinely good and noble. I have one more piece of Aristotelian background before we move on, and this is about truthfulness. Aristotle discusses truthfulness as a virtue, but the discussion is narrower than we might expect. So this is book 4, chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle treats truthfulness as a virtue of self-preservation. So the truthful person accurately represents themselves, neither claiming more than is true, like the boaster, nor claiming less than is true, like the falsely modest person. This is valuable, but it is not a comprehensive theory of honesty in all domains. Aristotle is talking about how we present ourselves in social life, our accomplishments, our abilities, our status. He's not directly addressing negotiation tactics, legal advocacy, political messaging, or corporate miscommunication, or, of course, not soccer. And this is an important point because Aristotle doesn't give us a single ready-made virtue for what we might call communicative excellence in adversarial roles. That virtue, if there is a virtue like that, needs to be reconstructed from Aristotle's broader resources. His account of practical wisdom, his account of justice, his account of how virtue relates to flourishing. And what I do in the paper is precisely that reconstruction, or what I attempt to do in the paper. Now, let me move to the roles. And so, do roles matter? That matters morally. So a key dimension of our moral life is lived through in social contexts and social institutions. We define ourselves at least partially by reference to the institutional affiliations and the roles we play. Many important human enterprises are pursued collectively and cannot be achieved individually. Many collective goods can only accomplish through human cooperation in social institutions. And roles, the roles we play, they are embedded in social institutions, which are defined and publicly justified by reference to the goods they promote. So families raise children, universities develop and transmit knowledge, and business create wealth. In short, roles and institutions provide opportunities for the cultivation of virtue, for the development of virtues, or sometimes they don't, and actually they provide opportunities for the development of vices. So the answer to the question that I have as the title of this slide is that roles, yes, they are important. They are socially important, psychologically important, and also morally important. And they carry some moral weight. And so when you start playing a role, you became a different kind of person in a sense, insofar as you became accountable to other agents, and you have a different standing. And what follows from that is that actions that could be morally objectionable outside of that role that you play might seem justified by the role and the institutions the role are playing. So basically, role plays are said to be permitted and sometimes required to do things that would be morally wrong outside of the role, as we saw with the soccer player, the criminal defense lawyer, and the politician that we discussed at the beginning. Um, Now, this gets more complicated when we're talking about adversarial roles or adversarial context. An adversarial context is a practice that is structured competitively rather than cooperatively. So the basic idea is that parties pursue opposed or conflicting ends, and the practice is designed on the assumption that this competition, when properly regulated, yields good outcomes. So think about adversarial adjudication in law. Prosecution and defense each advocate for their side, and the competition between them is supposed to produce just verdicts. Or think about markets. Buyers and sellers each seeking the best deal for themselves, and the competition supposed to produce efficient pricing. Several features characterize this context, this adversarial context. So uh, success often depends on strategic advantage. So knowing more than your opponent, anticipating the moves, controlling how information is revealed. Information asymmetry is part of the picture. It's common. Actually, sometimes it's the whole point about it. And controlled self-presentation is sometimes expected. You don't reveal everything. You present what advances your position. So many adversarial institutions, again, courts, markets, competitive sports, serve valuable social functions. The question is not whether institutions are legitimate, but how a virtuous person navigates the tensions between those roles and the personal lives or personal values. And for a virtue ethicist, the question is what counts as an ethical excellence in a context designed for competition? Here we have Alasdair MacIntyre, another prominent virtue ethicist, describing the role of a corporate executive and saying that in that role, the manager not only has no need to take account of, but must not take account of certain types of considerations which he might feel obliged to recognize were he acting as parent, as consumer, or as citizen. So the we can, I think I'm going to pass on this more quickly, but if you follow this, if you are concerned about what is permissible, what is required, and what is prohibited, there are basically three ways in which you can account for these conflicts, what I call reduction, autonomy, and aggregation. But in the interest of time, I'm going to pass and focus on what really matters for us, which is how those who care about virtues see the role problem and whether the very idea of role virtues makes sense or not. Because the right question for a virtue ethicist is not whether some, uh, bluffing might sometimes be permissible or required, but inside of the role that is not outside of the role, but rather whether the character of the action is actually honest or deceptive. Because again, remember, Aristotle is mostly concerned about character and not about the action itself. And so that, as I mentioned, roles and institutions play an important social, psychological, and moral role. So socially, they provide goods that are achieved through the common project that the role made possible. Psychological, they provide opportunities for mental and moral improvement. And morally, caring about our common endeavor for their own sake constitute human flourishing. And so a virtue ethicist has good reasons to take roles, professional roles, seriously. But for the virtue ethicist, the conflicts between role virtues and generic virtues will appear, and that's the puzzle that we are considering, right? I mean, whether the character traits that you need to succeed in your professional roles, in adversarial roles, coincide, overlap, or actually radically disagree from the character traits that you need to flourish as a human being or to live a good life. So that's actually the puzzle that I've been mentioning so far, what I'm calling the inversion of virtue and vice. So again, the puzzle is that there are different means. If we get back to the doctrine of the mean, there are different means between extremes for agents performing different roles. And so the virtuous action may vary from one context to another, and certain vices are considered virtues, so such as ruthlessness in government roles, as Tom Nagel says, or hypocrisy in business roles, and this famous piece by Batson, and aggressiveness in soldiers, and arrogance in professional sports. And some other virtues are considered dysfunctional or even like a vice. So authenticity is being as a vice in business, according to business guru Jeffrey Pfeffer. Modesty is discouraged in professional sports, empathy in criminal defense lawyering, sincerity in diplomacy. So getting back to the chart that I showed you before, here we can see vices that became the mean and presumably became virtues, such as ruthlessness in government, hypocrisy in business, aggressiveness in the military, arrogance in professional sports. And other virtues that are considered to be vices in this inverted virtues scheme. So again, authenticity as a vice in business, modesty as a vice in sports, empathy as a vice in legal practices, etc. So now, why do adversarial contexts produce this ethical inversion, this strange phenomenon where deception looks like virtue and honesty looks like weakness? Well, I think there are three mechanisms that are important here. First, I'm going to call it outcome salience. So in competitive roles, success is highly visible. So you win the case, you close the deal, you score the goal. But character is opaque. We cannot see someone's inner state, inner dispositions. We can only see the results. So we tend to infer excellence from results. And if you win, you must have been excellent. And if winning requires strategic deception, then strategic deception must be excellent. Well, we know that this is problematic, confusing effectiveness with virtue. But it's a natural mistake in competitive environment, as we all know. A second explanation are role scripts. Professional roles often require controlled self-presentation. So a lawyer advocates for a client, not for his own personal views. A negotiator represents an organization, not her personal preferences. A politician must navigate coalitions, constituencies, and strategic constraints. And even a genuinely honest person operating under these constraints can look hypocritical to outsiders who don't understand the role. The public performance differs from what they might say in private, not because they are being deceptive, but because the role requires a kind of partial advocacy. And third, habituation effects. So if a role systematically rewards manipulation and punishes candor, agents are gradually trained to take pride in what they are really like vices, strategic insincerity, comfort with misdirection, cynicism about truth. So what begins as just doing my job can become a settled character trait over time, and that's a vice. So the result of these three mechanisms is that adversarial contexts systematically distort our moral perception. Deception looks like excellence. Honesty looks like a defect. And we need to understand this distortion if we're going to evaluate these roles correctly. So that takes us to the truthfulness in Aristotle. But I don't intend this paper to be a contribution to this very important debate in business, but I'm going to point that out. I mean, this is the famous piece by Albert Carr, published, I think it's the first, talking about deception in business. It's 1968 article published in the Harvard Business Review, where he first introduced this poker analogy, right? And business is like poker, and bluffing in poker is okay, so it follows that bluffing in business is okay as well. Um, that has been continued by literature, not only in business ethics and moral philosophy, but also by working in the social sciences. So I mentioned before in passing the work by Daniel Batson and collaborators on moral hypocrisy. This is a famous piece published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And also, well, he actually framed moral hypocrisy as a virtue in a journal, in an article published in the Journal of Business Ethics in 2006. So all I'm saying here, I'm not positioning this paper as part of a contribution to this conversation, but I want to mention that there is a rich body of literature in business ethics about the ethics of deception and whether it is whether deception is permissible, with very recent publications by Shergood and Alan Stradler in Business Ethics Quarterly in 2025, I mean last year. Um, I want to make this, so what I want is to make it clear that deception is not a single uniform category. Shergood, well, the title of Shergood's article is "A Lie is Always a Lie," but I think we need to distinguish different forms of deception because they might differ morally. Well, lying is, again, the clearest case. You assert something you believe to be false. But there are other forms of deception. Misleading, for example, is inducing a false belief without literally lying, perhaps by arranging true facts in a misleading way or by exploiting what you know someone will infer. Another form is what we might call a strategic omission, which is withholding information you could reveal. You don't say anything false, you just don't say everything you know. Another form, we might call it a strategic ambiguity, which is speaking in ways that permit multiple interpretation, saying something that could mean A or B and benefited from the uncertainty. And then, yes, we have feints and bluffs and tactical moves that within competitive contents that everyone understands are part of the game, like poker. So, getting back to soccer, a soccer feint is a deception in some sense, but it's not a betrayal of trust in the way lying to a friend could be. So these forms differ in at least three ways: in what they target, in the harms they cause, and in how they relate to the practice in which they occur. And so treating them all as morally equivalent will not be able to explain what's going on in adversarial context. So we need to distinguish these different kinds of deceptions, and that's what I'm doing next. So I want to distinguish, let me check the time. Oh, yes, I'm going to rush a little bit, but distinguish three different kinds of deceptions in adversarial roles that are, I take to be ethically different. So the first type one is what I call constitutive strategic moves. And these are actions that are internal to the practice, mutually understood by participants and bounded within the competitive arena. The paradigm is the soccer feint again. Everyone playing soccer knows that misdirection is part of the game. The defender expects the attacker to try to deceive her. That's the whole point of the game. So within this bounded practice, the feint is not a violation of trust, but a display of skill, and so is celebrated as a skill. We should understand type 1 moves as expressions of what Aristotle called techne. It's like a skill, a craft. It's not a moral virtue or a moral vice. The lack of it is not a moral vice. Type 2, I call it mean admitting departures. These are strategic communications that go beyond what is internal to the practice convention, but might still be permissible under certain constraints. For example, maybe withholding your reservation price in a negotiation, or maintaining discretion about the client's confidential information in a legal advocacy. So these are not simply skills, they raise genuine ethical questions, but they might be permissible when governed by practical wisdom, when constrained by justice, with a concern for trust, by proportionality. Type 2 is the most problematic and is morally risky. It requires ongoing vigilance and honest self-examination. And type 3 is what I call mean excluding deception, deception that is wrong in itself or that reliably corrupt character and trust. And that includes, exploiting someone's vulnerability, manufacturing false evidence, or systematically lying to those who have no means of defense. These type 3 deceptions are vices, even when they are professionally rewarded. No role can make them permissible. So the taxonomy, whether you like it or not, I think, and it's still work in progress, and I know that it's controversial, especially the type 2, but the point is to give us a way to sort the cases. So when we observe deception in adversarial roles, we can ask, well, is this type 1, 2, or 3? And the answer may differ across different cases and even across moments within the same practice. So how does the practically wise person navigate type 2, which seems to be the most problematic cases? Well, I propose 6 constraints or questions that practical wisdom must address when evaluating these strategic communications in adversarial roles. The first is the telos. What is the practice for? What are its internal goods? And this matters because role expectations are not the final standard. If a practice has gone wrong, if its conventions have become corrupt, practical wisdom should recognize that, not simply defer to it. A second question is justice. Does this tactic wrong another person? Does it exploit vulnerability, violate fair terms, deprive someone of what they're entitled to? Justice is not inherent to role. It applies across them. The third is about flourishing and more specifically about trust. So does this tactic undermine the broader conditions of human flourishing, the trust, cooperation, and reliable communication that make social life possible at all? Even a locally successful tactic can be globally destructive if it erodes trust. The fourth is habituation. I mean, what is repeated use of this tactic doing on my character? What kind of person I became? I'm becoming more manipulative, more cynical, more comfortable with deception. Aristotle teaches that we became what we repeatedly do. So if a practice is shaping me in traveling directions, then that's ethically significant. A fifth question, I'm calling it containment, has to do with whether the practice stays bounded within its proper domain or it leaks into general dishonesty. Adversarial practices are especially prone to leakage. The skills you develop for negotiation can migrate into your personal relationship, to the way you treat your wife, your kids, your neighbors. And the last one, proportionality. Is this the minimum departure from candor needed for a legitimate end? Or I'm just rationalizing convenience, advantage, or laziness. So these constraints, they don't give us an algorithm. They give us considerations that practical wisdom must weigh. And they help us distinguish type 2 from type 3. I have just 5 minutes remaining, so but what the paper does next is to illustrate how this works in the context of negotiation, which could be hard because it is at the boundary between contest and cooperation, and parties have opposed interests, but on the other hand, they're trying to reach a mutually beneficial agreement. And so some negotiation tactics plausibly resemble type 1, say opening offers that no one expects to be final. So insofar as they are, I'm making an assumption here, constitutive conventions of the practice, then mutually, they are skilled, they're not advised, they are mutually understood by experienced negotiators. But negotiation also invites genuine type 3 violations, lying about the product, misrepresenting material facts, exploiting a counterparty who lacks relevant information or sophistication. Those wrongs the other party and should not be reframed as just how negotiation works. And again, the hard cases come under type 2, strategic omissions or ambiguity that goes beyond clear conventions, but may still be permissible under certain constraints. And so here, the wisdom question becomes essential. So we need to ask whether it is legitimate expectation of disclosure in this context, whether I'm exploiting vulnerability or just competing with a peer, and what do you do if trust is generalized? And so the mean in negotiation, I want to suggest, is not just lying, as if honesty and deception were on a spectrum where we should pick a point in the middle. The mean is a posture of strategic restraint governed by fairness, and we're competing vigorously without wronging and preserving the possibility of trust and ongoing relationships, and using the meaningful departure from candor that is necessary for legitimate ends. So now, to answer my question, I think we are now in a position to answer the paper's title directly. What is a virtue hypocrite? Or is the virtuous hypocrite virtuous? My answer is that the virtuous hypocrite is not a character ideal we should embrace. It's a name for an error, a diagnostic illusion with two faces. In one direction, we have virtue resembling hypocrisy. A genuinely virtuous person operating under the constraint of a professional role may appear hypocritical to outside observers. The defense lawyer who advocates for a client she privately doubts. The negotiator who doesn't reveal her full hand. The diplomat who speaks ambiguously. These may be virtuous agents whose role performance look like like personal insincerity, but it's not. They are navigating real constraints with practical wisdom, doing what the role legitimately requires. In the other direction, hypocrisy can resemble virtue. So a skilled performer of moral language, someone who controls the self-presentation, who manage impressions, who project plausible sincerity, may be admired as if they possess genuine virtue. But what is being admired is cleverness, which is, again, techne. It's a skill. It's not virtue. It's not moral virtue. It's a skill at managing appearance. It's not genuine moral excellence. Adversarial contexts generate both kinds of illusions because they reward strategic communications and make character opaque. The doctrine of the mean does not fail in this context, but it can appear to fail when we are deceived by these illusions. So I'm saying, I just said the doctrine of the mean does not fail in adversarial context, but what adversarial context reveal is that the mean cannot do the work alone. And it was never supposed to do that. The mean is determined by practical wisdom, which means we cannot just look at what a role expects and conclude that that's the mean. Practical wisdom judges role norms. It doesn't simply inherit norms. Some role expectations are corrupt, and the wise person must recognize those. Mean judgments presuppose justice. A tactic that wrongs someone is not the mean, even if the role permits that practice. Justice constrained what counts as virtue. Mean judgments also must serve flourishing, not just professional success, but a generally good human life. A practice that rewards manipulation may produce external goods while deforming or corrupting the agent's character and eroding the trust that social life requires. The practical wise person cares about these effects. And mean judgments are shaped by habits. What we do repeatedly, well, we became that. So if a role is training us towards cynicism and manipulation, well, maybe something is wrong, even if we are succeeding in that role. So the mean is relative to us, relative to the agent and relative to the situation. But it is not relative to the job description. Role expectations are evidence, not the final standard. The standard is what a genuinely prudent, wise person would do in the circumstances. So I don't think I have time for objections. I'll just mention them. The first is about whether my account is going to a sort of full relativism that entails the fragmentation of morality and the fragmentation of virtue. The second is that what I'm doing is really not virtue ethics, but consequentialism, a sort of rule consequentialism using Aristotle's language. And the third one is the traditional dirty hands objection that says that well that deception is not permissible at all, but that the mark of the virtuous role player is the regret or the moral remain that comes from experiencing the wrong that these role players are performing. I think we have good resources to answer them and even more to talk about virtue in business. And I'm going to pass on this and go just directly to the to the conclusions. This is all very interesting stuff, but maybe we can cover that later on. But to conclude, well, I have said the roles are important, social important, psychological important, and moral important. And so virtuosists have reason to take those roles seriously. I think the virtue approach has better resources than the rival approaches to account for the role problem, to account for why roles matter. Um, uh, but it has to deal with these conflicts of, with this puzzle of character traits that seem virtues in adversarial contexts that are indeed vices in ordinary life. And so, in conclusion, I'm saying that the virtuous hypocrite is not a character ideal to be embraced. There is no one who is both genuinely virtuous and genuinely hypocritical in a stable way. And what exists are perceptual illusions. Virtue looks like hypocrisy, and hypocrisy there is hypocrisy that looks like virtue because adversarial contexts distort this moral perception. The doctrine of the mean does not fail in adversarial context, but I think it survives the test, but it survives only when we apply it with the full resources of Aristotelian ethics, including practical wisdom, justice, habituation, and a kind of human flourishing. And professional roles are formative. So when we do repeatedly, we became. So the question for anyone playing adversarial roles is not what can I get away with, but what kind of person I am becoming. If the role is training you towards manipulation, maybe something is wrong. And even if you are succeeding by the role owns standard. So the Aristotelian tradition, I think, give us the resources to ask this question and to evaluate the roles we inhabit. And that's what I have tried to show today. So thank you again. This is work in progress, and I welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you, Miguel. That's great. Maybe we could unshare the screen.
Yes, let me do that right now.
So for audience members, there's two ways you could ask a question. You could use the raise hand function, which is at the bottom of the screen, and I will unmute you and you could talk. And then you could also, if you prefer, use the Q&A function or the chat function. Eric Peterson, so go ahead, you could go.
Hey, Miguel. Thanks so much for your talk. Really like this paper. It's got me thinking about a lot. Um, and sorry with my voice, I'm just getting over a sickness. But um, I had a few questions about like the role in like the inversion aspect and talking about role versus generic virtue. Um, and it got me thinking, like, what if we just like used pretense or something like pretense um to explain like the role, right? So it's not really an inversion, but there's a kind of performative aspect or a pretend a fictional virtue, if does that make sense?
Mhm.
So what would I got a separate question from this, but what would you like it doesn't so I guess the it's less puzzling because we don't have to worry about there being like an inversion of the mean. It's not actually virtue, right? It's sort of a fictional or a pretend in this pretense or this sort of yeah, this um Yeah, something like that.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. Is that you had a question or is the same? I think I heard only one question. Maybe I got that
I
wrong.
have a second one, but if you, yeah,
Okay. Okay, good.
ask that first, or you.
Yeah, good. Well, yeah, thank you for the question. Um, well, I can. So if it is not a virtue at all, it doesn't present any problem for the for virtue ethics, right? I mean, suppose that we are talking about to make it very, very fictional, we might think about an actor, right? An
Right.
actor who is playing a ruthless dictator, and he's saying the words that are written in the script. So those are not his words. Still, he has to, compenetrate himself with the character and think deeply about it and think how a ruthless dictator would think and feel and act. Um, it's hard for me to say. I mean, as a matter of fact, I know, and you probably know as well, stories of actors and actresses who have suffered the consequences of playing a very traumatic role
Oh, sure.
in their personal lives. But I would never say that the virtues, those fictional virtues that an actor has developed, I would agree with you that those are not virtues at all, but those shouldn't present a problem for the virtue ethics because they don't entail any conflict. I mean, if we know that it's just fiction, if say, suppose that when I'm, reprimanding my kids, I pretend to be tough while I'm not. Um, but if it is just fictional and if it doesn't become part of me, I don't think it is a problem for me, and I don't think it is a problem for virtue ethics. But maybe I'm missing something there that you wanted to say because I don't mean to dismiss the. Well, actually, it was a question,
No,
but if it was a sort of an objection, I wanted to take it more. Maybe I'm missing something.
no, sorry. I wasn't necessarily raising it as an objection. It was a way of describing a sort of another way of describing the inversion. I mean, I guess would it be an objection if the inversion isn't um if we're not talking about real virtue, then the concern of the puzzle doesn't it dissipate a little? Like
Yes,
like
yeah.
the
I mean, the puzzle makes sense insofar as it is a puzzle, and so, for example, when we're talking about deception, even deception in negotiations, we're talking about you telling a lie,
yeah,
right? And so, if this is just getting back to poker, if this is just it's not, well, first of all, if it is not even if it is not a lie, and the expectations are not that you tell the truth,
right.
then um, that would count as part of what I consider type one and would disappear. Now, it would be hard to say that those things are role virtues. Maybe you are good at misrepresenting certain things, uh, but that would hardly count as a virtue. So I would be reluctant to call that role virtues. However, the existence, if there are some role virtues, that is more problematic for the virtue ethicists. But those virtues that, as you said, they only play a performative action and they're not really deep dispositions, deep character traits. Um, those that doesn't seem to create the puzzle I'm trying to address in this paper.
Eric, maybe we'll circle back for your second
Yeah.
question.
No, that's totally fine.
Okay. Yep. Hold on. Santiago.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk, Miguel. So, I agree with the ending part of the paper. I think virtue ethics has a lot of tools to not so like make sense of how different roles require different things of us. But I'm super puzzled and kind of like I think that has to be mistaken about the inversion of virtues. Like, and even to think that these people are still considered virtuous. Like, I don't see any kind of way in which I can think that Maradona, as much as I celebrated the goal, I don't think that he was honest in any kind of way, right? Now, whether it's appropriate or not, I don't know. Like, I thought it was at the time. I'm not sure anymore. But it seems that there's different ways of accounting for that, and is that certain roles, I mean, and this is to use McDowell's language, like silence certain dimensions of our lives where those are not supposed to be particularly relevant. And you can still, I think, use your kind of like characterization to identify how certain virtues that are not the salient virtues of a particular role play out, right? But to say that now the virtue of honesty means to being dishonest seems to me totally against common sense, which is one of the things that Aristotle seems to be valuable about. So I wonder, like, why do you think you need an account where you grant that the virtues are inverted instead of saying certain virtues are exempted or you're not supposed to cultivate certain virtues in certain ways? Now, just to complement this question, like one thing that I worry about your account is that there's a certain sense, and this is connected with the dirty hands objection, there's a certain sense in which there's a remnant of the vice in these activities. Like, I don't know, like, uh, there's this saying that, a lawyer with a briefcase can steal more than 1,000 people with the guns. Like, there's a certain sense in which lawyers are taken to be dishonest. And I know many law professors who decided to be law professors because they just couldn't stomach being kind of like positioned to defend clients that thought they were guilty. So one worry about your account is that I think there's a remnant of vice in these roles that are roles that play an important role in our lives, in our moral and social lives, but still that remnant, I think, is something that your account is missing. And one that I think you could sort of like reivindicate by having a different account of the inversion of virtues in favor of something different, like silencing of virtues, or some virtues are the salient ones for this role.
Okay. Can you repeat the first question? Because I mean, I think you made several claims, but I didn't understand well the first
So
objection.
it seems to me very weird to say that lawyers are super honest. It's just that what honesty means is different in that case. I am totally willing to say that honesty requires very different things in very different contexts, right? But it seems that there are certain roles, like lawyers, that are characteristically taken to be dishonest, and I think it's okay for them to be dishonest given their role. Now, you want to say, no, no, no. In that case, dishonesty is what honesty looks like. What it means to be honest is to tell lies or to defend, guilty people. And there's a different account. There's different ways of accommodating for that kind of like mismatch by saying that, like McDowell says, that, certain things are silenced. The virtuous person silences certain things. So the virtuous lawyer silences considerations of honesty because that's not relevant to his practice or her practice, right? So the question was like, why do you want and defend an inversion of virtue instead of defending like a silencing of certain virtues that are not just relevant for those roles?
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, you're good. Um, Thank you. So, first of all, the inversion of virtues that I'm discussing is I was not really defending that, but presenting it as a foil or and actually what I say in the paper, and I hope it was well articulated in the presentation, is that I think there is an illusion. I mean, I think the virtuous hypocrite is just nonsensical, and it's just a provocative title. I don't intend that to be a real character. Now, I'm not saying, maybe I might have said that sentence rhetorically, but I'm not saying that the virtue of the criminal defense lawyer, sorry, that the criminal defense lawyer is honest when he doesn't disclose that information. Um, I can understand the move that you're saying that, this is not a trade that belongs to that profession. That's one move. The one that I'm using, but again, only to use as a puzzle to motivate the the paper is the idea that because I originally wrote the paper as a contribution to conversation about the doctrine of the mean and about vices. Uh, um, so I I'm not defending the inversion of virtue and vices, and I overall I agree what you are saying. Now it is one way to uh, 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 present it in the way you said. I mean, we're going to exclude certain character traits that don't belong here. For example, honesty when you're playing a soccer game, or when you're playing a poker game. Um, and as a matter of fact, I think this is totally consistent with what with the type one of deceptions that I'm accepting with my framework. Um, but I think that the most because those things are just skills. Again, even if we give them the status of good excellences, of good things, it would be just crafts. It would be, again, technique. But I think the most problematic cases are the ones in which, yeah, we we force, or the role forces the lawyer to withhold the truth and have an innocent person languish in jail for 26 years. And so for those cases, I think the puzzle remains. But I understand what you take as the best strategy. The only thing I'm saying is that I'm saying that the inversion of the mean and the idea of a virtuous hypocrite is just an illusion, and it doesn't appear there. Now, the the other claim that I do want to defend, and I think is the most difficult to defend here, because I mean, when we're talking about the legal profession, for example, the easiest way to avoid the dirty hands of objection, for example, is to say, well, look, if the problem is the system, if the legal profession characteristically uh, 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 tend to develop the bad character traits, there is something wrong with the profession. And so that is a call for social reform, or for to reform the institutions. And we are not going to solve it at the individual level, where we are raising questions about what kind of person I am and what kind of person I became by telling this lie or by withholding the truth. Um, but yeah, and that's roughly how I address the dirty hand objection. Um, but again, I'm not using the inversion of, I'm not endorsing the inversion of virtues, but rather using it as a way to present the puzzle of how certain character traits that we perceive to be good outside of the roles are considered to be bad in role, and the other way around.
Next
Thank you so
question is
much.
Arian Kennedy. Sorry, the other one. Yep.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for setting aside your time to give this presentation, Miguel, and for hosting this. I had a question. You kind of touched on it, I think, when you were answering Santiago and the last gentleman prior to him. I'm curious how these standards hold up when both, or say all involved parties, right? So there's multiple, um, have a mutual understanding of the engagement and the interaction. So say, and you brought up some very controversial examples. I'm glad you did, right? What politicians, lawyers, right, are typically viewed as the last gentleman mentioned, relatively dishonestly, right? I think there's an old adage that says there's no such thing as an honest politician, right? And you said maybe perhaps the reformation of these institutions is merited. which I wholeheartedly agree with. And let me preface to say that I hold a very high standard too when it comes to virtues. And I do think that most engagements, whether they be business, political, or in the case of the law, are very deceptive in how they are practiced. But yeah, I'm curious, how does these standards hold up when, say, these parties have an understanding that, okay, I'm going to lie, he's going to lie. Does this somehow change this, or is it still fundamentally on the human level as an individual, and it doesn't matter the context, even if there is that mutual understanding?
Oh, I thought, okay, let's see if I understand in the comment correctly, because what you said in the very last sentence sounded a bit different from what the way I was going to answer your question. Or so it seems that the again, when we're playing poker and I know that you are gonna lie, and you know that I'm gonna lie, or any other practice like that, where the deception is embedded into the practice, where there is an expectation and I'm gonna do it, and you know, and I know, and the same happens, you know, when I'm selling my house and and you know that I'm going to ask for more than that would really be my reservation price, and and you're going to make your first offer below what you're really willing to pay. When those things happen, uh, describing the way we just described it, that is part of what I take to be deception type 1, and that is the one in which I tend to believe that we have reason not to. I wouldn't call them virtues, even though they might be considered excellence. These are skills, abilities to play the game, to get a better price, etc. Uh, and those things, even if we praise them in role practitioners, we wouldn't call them moral. It's because it doesn't have to do, even if in a loose sense, it might have to do with your character. It's not part of your moral character. Now, what you said in your last sentence was a bit passing for me, because you seem to be saying that generalizes not just to the roles, but also to any human interaction where there is an expectation that the other person say is gonna lie. And so if that is the case, then well, what follows from that? Is that what you were trying to say?
Yes, yeah. Let me clarify. So I think you touched on you touched well on where I was alluding, and I think maybe it was redundant in some of the questions that were asked prior to that. But yeah, I mean, on an individual level, um ultimately, don't these things end up just boiling down to the practice regardless of context? So we can try to obfuscate and obscure as much as we like, but at the end of the day, these practices, and as you mentioned, you know, how you conduct yourself over and over, these habits build will uh, manifest itself into your character. So regardless of context, it seems like um, uh, I'm trying to word this in a way that isn't inappropriate, but it's just, you know, all pretense. It's all for show. We're perhaps overcomplicating something that really is simple in its truth and how it is portrayed initially.
Um, yeah, again, like in the previous comment, I thought I got an understanding that was a bit changed by the last sentence, but let me say this. If there is a problem here, is the problem of role morality, right? The problem that sometimes you might be allowed or even required to do things in the role that you are not allowed to, or even prohibited outside of the role. If that happens, is because we think that roles have some sort of importance that make those practices permissible, not just legally permissible, because in the case of the lawyers, we're talking about the legal obligations, but also morally permissible or required. In the end, something that you do mention in your comment, I think that's ultimately is the answer. I mean, in the end, for a virtue ethics, is whether something is acceptable or not depends on how it reflects on the character, on your character. So for a virtue ethicist, I think that you can make a case for a virtue ethicist telling a lie, one lie, and we have thousands of examples like that. We use that in the classroom all the time. We can see a virtue ethicist justifying why I'm lying in this particular case. And the reason why this lie doesn't ruin my character is because it doesn't reflect poorly on the kind of person that I am. Now, when I do that every day, when that becomes part of my job, then I mean it is clear that the risk of you becoming the roles you play. I mean, we in the academia, for example, we are proud of having some intellectual traits that we develop as a result of our profession. So similarly, those things that, you know, when you choose a profession, you are choosing the kind of person that you are going to be. And if the role that you choose is to, you know, to be part of the mafia, well, the kind of things that you will characteristically do every day will have an impact on your character different than if the choice that you had made is to be a nurse. So in the end, within the roles or outside the roles, what matters to determine the status of an act and the status of a practice is how they reflect on your character. But the part that I didn't think I totally got was that everything is about all show and all pretense. But maybe maybe we are thinking about something very specific about maybe about politics or something like that. And yeah, but maybe we can continue. But I don't know if there are more questions anyway.
Well, if I could jump in, I'll
Yeah.
take the liberty to ask a couple. So, I guess the first question I have is about the first category. And I think that's where you're putting the soccer examples is in the first category. Several times you've said that, you know, it's not really about virtue, it's more like techne in those kind of cases. Um, I guess one concern I have is that in this first category, we're sort of making this whole role-playing kind of uh constitutive strategy moves amoral. Like it's beyond moral categories. And I guess and I think this is implicit in some of the previous questions is that like maybe we don't want to do that. I mean, maybe we still want to maintain the ability to morally evaluate both character and actions, but if we're just talking about virtue ethics, like the character of the individuals, uh, given the nature of the role. So, like even in the golden hand kind of case, I sort of agree with Santiago that in the end, I still think uh, it's a vice. It's a even within that role. Like I don't want to take it as just skillful play within the rules of a game where the goal is to win. Because the second thing, so I'll tie this together. In the second category, you mentioned some of the constraints, and one of those constraints is justice. It didn't seem like justice was really a constraint in category one. But I think if you go back to the golden hand example, you could say that this deceptive or misleading act deprived another is an injustice in that it deprived a victory to the opponent who deserved to win, given the context, this wasn't really a goal, right? So yeah, he exhibited a great deal of techne. Um, but I guess part of what you made this distinction at the beginning of your talk between being clever and virtue is different. And I guess many of the examples just seem to be clever. Like, he's, that was a clever move to play it off and pretend like it was a goal is a clever move. I wouldn't say it's a virtuous move. Um, and I wouldn't even adjust the mean. Like, I wouldn't even think that this is about trying to define a different context of the mean within this role of playing soccer or football. Uh, um, I would call it what it is, which I think is a deceptive act, which was skillfully performed. So great techne there. But I wouldn't define it as virtuous. B, I wouldn't want to take it beyond the realm of morality and say it's an amoral, because then I think the concern, I think, is partly what the last questioner was asking. A lot of our roles within society could then just be defined as amoral, right? It sort of generalizes in a very dangerous kind of way. So what I'm thinking of is something like Dick Cheney, who justified torture and enhanced interrogation and a lot of things after 9/11. And he has a very particular and very, like, strong defense of what he did. Like, he's not apologetic. And part of his explanation is you don't know what it takes to rule a country, to run a country. The, the deep, dark, dirty secret of being a leader is that you have to do whatever is necessary to keep the country safe. Um, and so if we were just to see this within the role of, politics or the role of statecraft, if you want to put it in Machiavellian terms, he's very good. He's got good technique. And I would resist moving and adjusting the mean to define those kinds of actions as virtuous rather than say that there's some other category. But there's a lot there I threw out there. Yeah.
Okay, good. But this is all good and very, very interesting. So let me. So first of all, one thing that I want to say is that the Maradona thing is not in the paper. I do have a soccer player, I do have a lawyer, and
Yeah.
I do have a politician,
Yeah.
but I don't. They were all fictional. To make it
Yeah.
more entertaining, I brought
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But no, but the reason why I'm saying this is because when the type ones that I have under the different kind of deceptions were about feint and was not about deceiving the referee. I mean, it is one thing to deceive your opponent and another thing to deceive the referee. In soccer, in poker, in whatever, right? So while I do think the feint is a type one, in the case of Maradona's, you call it the golden hand, but it's the hand of God.
Hand of God, sorry.
Uh, the Maradona hand of God, I don't, I would agree with you that it is even within the confines of a game. The maybe chance to at least to be articulated as a type two and not as a type one. Okay. So I'm very sympathetic to what you said. Now, and one more thing about soccer that I think it is important, even though it is more about soccer than about virtue ethics, is that, as a matter of fact, people make a big difference between youth soccer and professional soccer. And every time I mention soccer, at least in the paper, I don't know if I did it in the presentation, I was talking about professional soccer. And I did say, if you're playing, if we together are playing a game and we do that thing, I may do some physical, punishment on you. That's not how you play with friends. Now, when you're playing for money in a professional game, national teams with referees, whether something is a goal or not is something for the referee to be determined. It's not for you. I mean, that's how it works. And so the, the soccer people, they do make this distinction between whether we are talking about these practices in youth soccer, for example, and in youth soccer is wrong because you are educating, and in professional soccer. Same about doping, for example, things like that. But in youth soccer, and I think I mean, these are not virtue ethicists making these claims, but those practitioners who make these claims, I think the best way to ground that distinction is by appealing to education, formation, virtues, character. So I agree with that. Now, yes, the issue of I had two papers on this. One is on role virtues, and the other is on the doctrine of the mean. So maybe I'm stretching the mean, the doctrine of the mean a little bit, but I'm going to insist that I'm not endorsing the inversion of the mean. I'm saying there is a perception that these virtues are vices and these vices are virtues. And I'm trying to explain, to make sense of why that perception exists, but I think it is wrong. So I'm very Aristotelian on this. It's getting a bit dark. Can I turn
Yeah.
my light on? So, but my point is very I mean very consistent with Aristotle. But you say one more thing. Oh yes. So about the thing of making these practices amoral. Yeah, I think it is a concern, and it is a serious concern in business. And I mentioned, not approvingly, but I did mention the piece by Albert Carr on business bluffing. And I think there is a problem with the analogy. I do think there is a serious problem with the analogy. So maybe yes. Yeah, I mentioned the piece as a way again to interest the audience about the ramifications of this, but not approving that business is like poker. I don't think the analogy is good, and because it is not good, I think that most of the examples of negotiation that people are describing as okay, I think in my account would be problematic. But still, I think that I'm playing with this a little bit, and I'm trying to find ways to find whether a type 2 practice in business could be defensible. I think that's the most problematic, because otherwise we get. I mean, in one of the objections, I address this issue, right? I mean, the most easy way is to dress yourself as Aristotle and says this doesn't make any sense, and that's it.
Yeah.
So I want to take these roles a bit more seriously.
Well, thank you. It looks like we used up all your time, and we kept you to roughly 5:30. So I don't see any other pressing questions. I think we'll just thank you for your wonderful talk, for giving us a lot to think about, and hope to see some of you guys again at the next seminar. So we have a series that runs throughout the semester, and there are 3 more coming up. So thank you, Miguel. That was really wonderful.
Thank you, Greg, for the invitation, for having me here, for the questions, and thank you all for being here and for your comments. I have taken notes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay well.